Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about designing social value. I'm Chloe McCulloch, Building Design's editorial director, and I'm delighted to welcome a very experienced panel, including two people who have been instrumental in developing the RIBA's social value toolkit. They are Riet Oosthuizen, partner at HTA Design. Apologies, Riet, for the pronunciation. Flora Samuel, Building Design's social value columnist and also Professor of Architecture at the University of Reading, and Stephanie Edwards, founding director of Urban Symbiotic. So Riet and Flora will be able to talk about the intentions behind the toolkit, and we'll be discussing also how architects can raise the profile more generally of social value to clients, but also throughout the project team. There is so much to cover on social value, so I'm sure we can't cover it all in the time that we've got. But I think some of the key areas which I've just flagged to the audience now is kind of why architects need to be proactive in this area, what the opportunities are, what the challenges are for the profession. I think we'll also probably cover COVID-19, you can't escape it, but has it sort of propelled social value up the agenda? We'll obviously discuss the toolkit in some detail, how that can be used and what people should be looking out for. And I think also you can't really get away from data and metrics in the construction industry and the architecture profession at the moment, so we will probably cover that off too. But first of all, I think I'll go to Flora for some opening remarks about the RIBA Social Value Toolkit. And we will just go around the panel just understanding their priorities, and then from there we'll have a sort of conversation bringing out some of these themes. So over to you, Flora.
Right, thank you, Chloe. The Social Value Toolkit was developed bottom up by a group of practitioners who are part of this group called the Research Practice Leads, who lead on research in practice, including Riet. And it was really done in response to really a void in knowledge around what the social value of design might be. The Social Value Act came in 2012, but didn't really hit the fan until a few years ago when it, I think a lot of engineering and construction companies took it up, and it's become very engineering and construction orientated around jobs and apprenticeships. So we wanted to get across the message that that buildings themselves have inherent social value in the way that they connect people up together, the way they encourage healthy lifestyles, the way they foster positive emotions, that sort of thing. So it's really a provocation to architects to get started thinking about this issue. And we've also included in the tool some monetization proxies to get people thinking about the fact actually that their services do have those kinds of values. And sometimes you do have to talk about these things in terms of value. So we tried to make it super simple, really a starter for conversation with the architecture profession on doing a better job really about getting its social value across to others.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the overview. Riet, do you want to add in a bit about your involvement?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chloe. Thanks for being inviting me to be involved in this discussion. I am not an architect by training. I'm an urban planner at HTA Design, but we sort of portray ourselves as an interdisciplinary organization, and it's really that we believe that it's a range of disciplines that contribute to good design. So, and I love being involved in the group that Flora set up, which is the Research and Practice Group, because it is very important to be able to share experiences across practices and understand what we're doing, being concerned about quality in the built environment. And it's really at one of these groups that we started a discussion about the fact that we know very little about how people experience the places that we design. And we decided to embark on this social value toolkit really to be the social sustainability part of post-occupancy evaluation, to connect these debates together. It's too often really that the social value is seen as part of the procurement spreadsheet that you need to fill in, and it's not an integral part of the discussion at the planning officer's table on what are the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. And it's creating this feedback loop that I believe we've created the starting of in the social value toolkit. So I look forward to seeing how people experience using it in future.
Okay, so just a quick question for the benefit of the audience, if they're not so aware of the toolkit, just either to Flora or Riet, what stage is it at, and how do people start using it?
Well, it's hot off the press last week, published by the RIBA. So it's on the architecture.com website, and anyone can use it. It's free to use. But if you do get very involved in the monetization proxies, you might have to pay a little bit to Hacked for using their proxies. But yeah, it's there, ready to use, and lots of people have trialed it and say they actually understood it, which is pretty pleasing, actually.
That's a good result, definitely.
It's a complicated subject, yeah.
Obviously, there are lots of small practices out there. Is it equally valuable for them?
For sure. I mean, it's really designed to get people on the journey of doing post-occupancy evaluation, and a small practice could really just decide that their practice mission was all about one particular question, like, for example, connecting communities, and they could really focus on that and just have one question that they ask on a regular basis to start trying to collect evidence of the value that they're adding. So it doesn't have to be. It's really definitely it's been trialed by small practices and large, and we really want it to be useful to both.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
if I could just add to that, it's really a library of questions based on 4 themes that relate to a lot of research on well-being. And it's simply that, it is a library, and something that we've done in our practice is we use that as a basis to actually expand on it and build some other questions in that we're hoping to go back to a range of our projects and revisit and speak to people.
Great. Okay, so I'm sure we can come back to some of the toolkit stuff, but before we do, I'd like to sort of broaden the conversation out a little bit and bring in Stephanie to just talk about, Stephanie, your priorities when it comes to social value.
Thank you for inviting me onto the panel today. So I'm an architect, but also an urban designer, and for me, social value has such a great opportunity for us as architects and urban designers. And we're really starting to embed social value within our practice. So not just in the way that we design, but also our approach. So I'm very much interested in how do we really start to understand the value that is needed and that can be enhanced from the beginning. So, how can we use stage 0 better? How can we really start to go to the communities, understand what value they need, and how we can start to embed that into our process? Because then we can really be innovative, like we'll have all of the tools as architects to really design for these holistic and sustainable places that are better for the people that we're designing for. So from my point of view, social value is so important, and it really should be the bedrock of everything that we do.
Okay, so that's great sort of opening remarks to kind of get us into the topic, but I know Stephanie, when we were sort of catching up before this session, and I think you highlighted really quite a lot of the community-based work that you do, and the I suppose how hard it can be, but how worthwhile it is to be able to connect with the actual people, and that I think really what you were saying is that people are at the heart of social value, and that's really what you're trying to bring out in the projects that you're working on. Am I right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, at Urban Symbiotics, what's interesting is two of the founders, so one of the founders was a product designer and myself as an architect, and so we're really looking at what if you bring this product design approach to architecture and urbanism, by really using focus groups essentially. So we really use this consultation and engagement process to ensure that you really get the mix of people from a community right at the beginning, so that they start to help inform the brief. So we're working on some regeneration projects at the moment, one particularly in Croydon. And so we're going to people who are working on food banks, going to different faith groups, but also going to that younger contingent, the people, the teenagers, the young people that don't necessarily get involved in shaping their environment. But actually it's so fascinating because you really start to understand the place in a very different way as soon as you have those different perspectives. Because if we're talking about value, if we're looking at social value, but also that environmental aspect and also economically, we really need to understand, you know, behaviours of people, or what are the barriers to people actually feeling empowered to even be in the process of helping to shape their space, but also use their space. As designers, we have so much, like such an ability to really enhance that space and value and that feeling of belonging. And so you need people to really get involved and enhance that and shape our way of thinking. So it's not just about architects talking and providing for communities, but more of a dialogue and a discussion. And I really believe that that's how we can really start looking at social value as something more integral, as opposed to you know, something we just add on to onto a project at certain stages.
Okay, so just sticking with that particular example that you brought up with Croydon, just to give us a little bit more context about the clients involved and the nature of the project. I'm assuming that's a local authority that you're working with.
It is. So we're working with their regeneration team. So that is super interesting. We found this real difference between regeneration teams compared to spatial planning, because they just have different remits. Regeneration is all about the people, and they're very much on the ground and hearing the voices of those who shout the loudest, but also some of those who are on the periphery, those that are talking to the community groups, to the, you know, the departments that are dealing with crises within the local authority. So their ear to the ground is so completely different. But we're working with them to look at a framework that will inform spatial strategy. So it's a really interesting play on how, as architects, we can start to look at, you know, this wider aspect of building places and environments. So yeah, so just in terms of regeneration, I do feel like as architects we do need to be broadening our views, like bringing on like social scientists and understanding what place means, how to create more of a pro-social place, because it's not just about the spatial quality, but it's also about, you know, the programmatic use of space. We can, if we're looking at the 21st century architect, it probably isn't just about you know, spaces being in the physical, but what does that also mean for the digital space, and how can we start to tie them together? One thing that we're looking at is creating a panel that's very specific for this regeneration framework, so that we always have a community to go to that represent each of the different people. So we'll have, like, you know, some that looks at, that represents the young mother, or the younger teenager, but also a child, but also look at those people who wouldn't normally be encouraged, or actually just feel empowered to be part of that discussion. So I just feel like we have like a lot of opportunity really, and we should really just be grasping it.
Okay, that's great. It's great to have an actual example of a project that you're currently working on. Just to go to Flora or Riette on this, I know just to think about the role of architects within social value, because I know that social value there's a possibility that it gets driven by the construction phase of a project. How do architects kind of take a hold of social value and try and make clients realize the value of design work, that the value that designers can bring to social value, if you see what I mean?
I think well, one of the things we had a go at in the social value toolkit is trying to define different parts of social value in the built environment, and there are of course the jobs and apprenticeships, things that clients generally are familiar with, and then there's the social value of design that we are discussing in the social value toolkit. But there are other things that we haven't really explored properly around stuff like the learning that communities have when they build and design with the project organisation. There's such a lot of learning to be delivered that way. And another thing which I think is shooting up the agenda is the social value of specification, specifying local materials and local services. And then there are other social value things within the social value within the organisation itself that's delivering. So I mean, those are just our first go at some of the dimensions of social value, and in a sense the toolkit is just trying to open up the conversation, because there's a real danger at this moment that it's just disappearing down one direction. And I'd really like to hand over to Riet to talk about her experience of bids and things, really, because it brings it to light.
Yes, I mean, I want to comment on something that Stephanie actually said, the fact that combining what she does with product design, because of course the housing industry doesn't work like that. We get people who build housing en masse to an unknown end user. And that is really a critical area which we need to develop. In the government is talking about design quality as a part of the Building Beautiful Commission recommendation. Design quality has gone up the whole agenda, yet there is no feedback loop that is built into the planning system as such, but also for us working in design practices and working on the built environment. And we really need to start learning from what people say and their experience of using the spaces that we design, so that we can start understanding the impact of some of the design decisions we make, and that we can start convincing our clients that for long-term well-being, it is worthwhile making certain decisions, trying to approach a scheme from a slightly different angle. Without this feedback loop, we will stay exactly where we are. The problem with social design, or social value rather, at the moment, and Flora's reference to procurement, is that when we answer procurement questions as part of the bidding process, the social value questions are part of a tool, a spreadsheet. It doesn't get directly linked to the design concept and how you've made certain design decisions and how you believe that will impact on long-term social value in a community. It's all about the number of employment opportunities during the construction process. There's no long-term evaluation of the actual place, and that is where we need to get to eventually, I believe.
And are you hopeful about that journey? Do you see inroads? I mean, we were discussing, I think, the fact that COVID-19 has brought to the fore so many social inequalities, and a call for housing and design to address some of those needs, you know, in this pandemic, but potentially for future pandemics. So is this an opportunity for architects to sort of see social value as a way to make a difference?
I certainly believe voices are congregating together. I think we are starting to talk about it a lot more. There's a lot more conversations about assessment tools. I think the critical link that we need to make is to combine social value very clearly with health and well-being and with design quality. And they're not separate conversations, essentially. And I think that's where we need to get to. So there is talk of many assessment tools being developed actually to assess quality. But I do believe that the social value toolkit is one useful example, and people are starting to talk about this more. And this is definitely an opportunity, as Stephanie said.
I build on that? Oh, but I was just, Stephanie referred to the economic, the environmental, and the social, and I personally, well, done quite a lot of work on trying to define design value, and for me, it's that three: it's the economic, the social, and the environmental. The triple bottom line is sustainability, and they need to be seen together or mapped together in layers so that you can see how they work together, and only then can we get a kind of holistic view of how things are. So I personally, if I could wave my wand and change bids, I would make bids be 33% economic, 33% social, and 33% environmental, because at the moment they are strange things, like there's quality in there. Nobody knows what quality is. And then social value or equality gets the most pathetic little thing in a bid. You know, it's laughable. So the way that even within bids that the criteria are weighed up, deeply problematic at the moment, and don't have any sort of meta viewpoint, no sort of overlying framework of thinking about how we might gather data, process data and think about spaces in a holistic way.
Just going in on that, and obviously we're talking about the sort of the procurement stage, and I know everyone talks about how vital procurement is. Do you see a trend by which, obviously there's a lot of different approaches at the moment, can you see a time when there will be more uniformity in approach for procurement?
I do hope so. The UK Green Building Council has set up an amazing task force to try and agree some top line headings around social value, which I think would be very, very useful on that journey. There are a number of initiatives going on, so I just hope that they can all agree with one another.
Is that the danger, in a way, that you've got a sort of an emerging area, everybody's interested in it, but there's lots of different hairs set running in different directions, and you have a moment like that, but then at some point someone's got to pull it all together and say, this is where we're going with it. Do you see a way forward where this can kind of be standardized and brought together so it's a bit more understandable?
Well, I hope that the UK Green Building Council will have a strong enough voice in this. Certainly the will from industry and the property sector is absolutely behind them. So I do believe that, but it will you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. So other systems are going to have to fall by the wayside a little bit. So in a way, it's just like juggling for power going on at the moment. What worries me is that architects aren't part of that enough.
So Stephanie, just to go back to sort of architects working on the ground, obviously you use social value a lot through the work that you're doing. Are you optimistic as a sort of practicing architect that social value is going to become more important in the work that you do and in winning work?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. Always optimistic, Chloe. But no, definitely, actually, because we've been going for quite a few different bids, and it's quite interesting to see the different criteria for social value. Some have their own toolkits depending on the different local authority. Some have definitive, how many hours are you spending within certain sectors of community, and they break it down to, how are you accommodating for the homeless and also for people with disabilities. But actually it does get you thinking. So even though metrics can be an issue where it's just a tick box, I do think it's good that we are having to think about this. But also, I think Riet was speaking about this, is that we need to ensure that it's picked up throughout the process. It shouldn't just be a tick box at the beginning where you offer a few internships and then you just leave it behind, because there are so many opportunities throughout the course of design and the course of construction that you can start to get people involved. What is social value? Is that like uplift of skills in the community? Is it also, having new role models on site, interacting with some of the community groups? Like, there's so many different ways that even as architects we can gain value from that process. Like, if you're doing consultation, is it better to have or engagement, isn't it better to have the community on the ground with you? But also what I'm really intrigued about is how we can really be innovative in this process, how we can use the data that we collect to make more interesting places, to make greater places, to make places that people feel more inspired, and they can feel like their aspirations can be filled, but also their fears mitigated. We were doing a project on a student dorm, and we were trying to look at this new generation of moving students into a new dorm and development. And it was just amazing how they held us to account of, we want to see how our building is sustainable and how we affect that. How can you design that into the process? So then you're having interesting conversations. And so it might start with a tick box, but actually by the end, if you do keep on track and remember that this is that focus of an approach as opposed to an add-on, then I think that we can only do better. And I'm in complete agreement that we just need to keep sharing the work that we're doing, both what works and what doesn't. So yes, optimistic for sure.
That's great. Just to pick up on that point that you made about sort of data and metrics, I know, Flora, you feel quite strongly, or correct me if I'm wrong, but that there's been a sense that you can't put monetary value on some of the social value aspects that maybe Stephanie's been talking about, but actually we need to find a way to put a monetary value on it, because otherwise within the whole process it will get lost, because the data-driven way that construction projects are going now, if social value is not incorporated in that, it will get ignored. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yes, well, that's a really good summary of it. I mean, whenever you talk about social value, people, particularly architects, don't like thinking themselves in monetary terms. But if you go and well, talk with local authorities or go and do a hacked social return on investment training, it's full of local authorities who are having to demonstrate everything they do because they're so cash strapped. They're having to demonstrate the numerical value of everything they do. And we live in this terrifying audit culture. So yeah, the world is, that's the way we are. And we have to sort of take that on the chin and develop metrics that can therefore be built into these things so that they can be taken note of. And an extension of being able to monetize and demonstrate social value is to then be able to use it to get funding from banks and funders. To show that you deliver demonstrable sort of impact for UK PLC, and also potentially we can start using social value for things like Section 106 planning gain. Why do people make a project that's inherently not very good, such that they have to pay a bit of extra money to make up for it with a planning gain thing? Why can't the project in it and of itself be good? And have the inherent goodness built into it, into its very DNA, and I think so. Monitoring and measuring impact could potentially lead into these things. We're seeing the greening of real estate is a phenomenon that's going on at the moment, and I think this stuff is just going to get more and more and more important as people cease to just evaluate on monetary terms.
Yeah, and if I can just add to what Flora said, I think that's really, really important, the greening of real estate, because ultimately where that debate needs to start is land value and the price paid for land. And if the social value debate can actually be part of that conversation, so the longer term positive impact that you produce actually affect land value, I think we would have gained a lot. Of particular concern to me is the government's emphasis on speed of delivery of housing. We should also look at quality, particularly long-term quality, and therefore we need to bring these two conversations together.
So at the moment, sorry, carry on, Flora.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that, because we're talking about metrics, but essentially it's really defining and communicating the value of social value, which is, I mean, if we can, for example, communicate that to developers to understand what the real value to them is of social value, to local authorities, to, you know, like this environmental gain, but also to communities, so that they do work symbiotically, essentially, and they're all, you know, working towards the same gain. But it's communicating that value, I think, that is a really big piece of work. But I do feel like we're on that way. But I do think metrics could help with that.
So
it makes me think of Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Value of Everything, which is essentially that local authorities, the activity of local authorities isn't included in measures of gross domestic product or whatever. And actually what's happening with developers is they're just doing things for economic value, and the societal risk is being passed to the local authorities, who are picking up on all the health and other problems that are costing them money. So I think that this feeds into those sorts of debates as well. But going back to the data question, I'm anticipating in 10 years or so that there's talk of things like the digital doppelgangers, the digital city models, which will model future systems of cities. Now, it's a very scary world in which there wouldn't be any social value in there, or any measurements to do with what people feel about the place. So I think that there's as digital modeling and apps and services more and more developing around keywords and things like that, we just have to have some uniformity and agreement on what they are. Otherwise they get lost in the morass of things, but also their value isn't captured in hits on the internet or connections.
No, I completely agree. There's just, you know, so I was speaking to these quantity surveyors and project managers. They're called Life Proven. And what's interesting about them is they're working on metrics for well-being. But as you said, I mean, there's a lot of different ways of calculating. But they're working with data to understand, you know, what actually affects your well-being the most, so that when you come to value engineer a building, you know what to actually remove that isn't going to inadvertently affect your well-being. So how can we be a bit more smart about the decisions that we make, having a holistic picture, as opposed to, you know, if the bottom line is the issue, but there are like 3 different ways to like skin a cat, then do it in a way that doesn't affect your well-being as much, you know. So I feel like there's a lot of nuances within it, but there's so many different ways. But yeah, if we can just work out a way to be on the same page, Flora, I agree. If we can just agree on one approach, it would be great.
So in Reading, where I work, we've done a project mapping social value on an estate, and they shut down the local swimming pool, and they're making that into key worker housing. Now, the impact on the community of the swimming pool shutting down has been terrible in terms of their social value. I mean, the key worker housing might be really important, but hopefully measurements of social value can offer a bit more intelligent kind of decision making around those things to work out which actually is the best thing to do. Those are the kind of decisions councils are faced with.
I was just going to flip that, because I remember, Riet, you mentioned a sort of, I don't know if you can remember now, we were talking about an example where a sustainable approach had been taken, I think, on a housing project, but the resident didn't understand what had been done to his home, and so I think knocked through something for his own reasons, and it all backfired, and there was sort of unintended consequences of not considering the actual person in the building.
I think it's very much coming down to that. So we have started using our own version of the social value toolkit, which we slightly expanded on a sort of social value driven post-occupancy evaluation approach at HDA. So we've started revisiting a number of projects. This was one resident, and part of it's talking to a lot of residents when we do our first observational visit, and we have come across this gentleman who lives in a super energy efficient designed flat, but felt very claustrophobic in it and decided to drill holes in the wall. I mean, something else that we've come across is a regeneration project where people have remarked that they really liked the new housing, but they didn't feel comfortable with the dimensions of the green space, and they felt a lot safer with how the green spaces were laid out before. And I think it's these very nuanced changes that we need to start understanding, because planning policy sometimes drives you to a certain design approach, whereas actually the experience of residents might lead you over the long term, if you've built up enough evidence, to a slightly different approach to enable a bigger community feel or a greater feeling of safety. And I think that's the level, and I think Stephanie already referred to that type of learning that we need to build up over time as well, that we need to get to, and it's the value of this type of approach.
Yeah, Stephanie, I think you mentioned, I think to me earlier, that you've done quite a lot of work with teenagers, who are not necessarily the easiest group to reach out to, but when you did a sort of quite extensive study with them, you found some quite surprising results and some quite surprising feedback about how they felt about being outside. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So we started just by looking at a workshop of talking to young teenagers about designing or looking at a 21st century estate. It was a school that was close to the Grenfell Tower, and so we were looking at, whilst that borough was under, this critique and spotlight as to how to really recreate a 21st century estate that's inclusive, we thought, let's speak to some of the younger people. And so whilst it was really interesting just to get them, you know, to understand what is their environment, what is their space, and one of the questions we asked them was, you know, where do you feel safe or where do you feel unsafe? And so the prevailing answer was, I feel unsafe outside. And so that was quite shocking to me, actually, quite shocking and disturbing. But then we spoke to some other schools in South London and also East London, and it was just the prevailing answer: I feel unsafe outside. And so for me as a designer, you know, looking at the public realm or looking at urban design proposals, how can I help, or, you know, am I designing something to respond or not respond to that? But without that information, it's, you know, I'm powerless to make a change. Or maybe it had nothing to do with the space, maybe it's the use, but actually it's about really involving and understanding that need from that community. And if young people are feeling unsafe outside, we really should be considering and thinking about that, you know, as architects, as designers, as, you know, change makers or people in the local authority managing these spaces. Like, how are we actually approaching this? I was listening to Dr. Carleen Furman, who's a social researcher, and she was looking at, you know, the neighbourhood actually being so important to the well-being and effect of a younger person as opposed to their home. Like, everyone thinks, oh, if there's an issue with a child, it's the home. No, actually, it's their neighbourhood. So we just really need to open our eyes, and we just really need to be thinking about how are we perpetuating this, or how can we start to alleviate some of this? But we do need to open up that conversation and really be, that needs to be on a platform. We can't be blind to this, is what I see.
I think definitely in the context and the times we're living in now, that definitely rings true, I think. Just to go back to the toolkit briefly, we talked about the intentions behind it, but Riette or Flora, do you have any examples of any practices that have been trialing this on particular projects or looking at it? I know, Riette, you said doing some post-occupancy work with it, and what your hopes are with any sort of feedback that you're getting from that already. Is there anything you can report back to us on with that?
Well, we did trial the toolkit, which is still a test, and we want to feedback from anyone who's going to send it to us through a few projects. But one particular one, it's meant to be used for housing, but I think it can be tinkered with for many different settings. And one practice, collective architecture, I think it was, they used it in a school, and they found that the headmistress of the school that they were talking about was excited because she didn't realize she was allowed to talk about these things when she was talking about architecture. It enabled her to talk about architecture in a new way, and in a different way from what she thought was the standard thing. And indeed, we found when using these toolkit questions out and about, if you're in an estate and people are spending their time, usually people are very angry when you go to a consult situation, it's the first time that somebody might listen to them, and they tend to spend a lot of time talking about, needles in the bushes and dog mess and stuff. But if you start asking them questions about where they have a positive emotion, they start talking about where they watch the herons or go fishing or watch the clouds, or it changes the nature of the conversation towards the positive, which is one of the things I really like about the questions we eventually came up with. I should say they're not rocket science. They relate very closely to the New Economics Foundation 5 Ways to Wellbeing. So so that was one group that tested them. But it has been, as we've had many stories of people going out there and testing the toolkit. And since we published it, we're excited because the co-housing group who are in Marmalade Lane, they're going to do a survey of their own projects going forward. So hopefully we'll get a lot more data coming through and we can test it and refine. That's the plan anyway. Yeah, I don't know if you want to, you had your own experiences, haven't you?
Yeah, so well, we've now trialed it on about 3 projects, but of course that is not remotely enough. We want to do it on all of our projects, and we want to use it as a practice to reflect on the lessons that we've learned. And it's not only the discussions with people, but also looking at the place after some time has passed. So that is really useful. I have to say that the toolkit in itself also has been quite informative in some design guidance that we're now producing for some of our RP clients. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for adopting this type of approach, which is really positive.
Great. And Flora, as well, I think you might have mentioned as well that Stride to Triglawen doing a post-occupancy piece of work during lockdown. Is that something?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that in my BD column, that some practices, and Stride's just one of them, have been using their staff on furlough or using the time they've got to go back to their housing developments to see how they've worked. And I think that's been a really positive message thing to do. I think people have learnt a lot. So it's just not nearly enough post-occupancy evaluation happens. I mean, we don't have any proper measures, but maybe 3% of buildings are looked at to see if they work. And that was a few years ago. And the RIBA has been working very hard to try and up that rating and making changes to their insurance and all sorts of things. And we publish work on that zone. So, yeah, I think it was very clever of Strides to go and have a check out how they're, clever and the right thing to do, clearly, just to go and see if their project's working. But how gratifying, you know, being an architect is a tough old business. You see people enjoying your projects. I think people are very nervous to go back to their projects. They think they're going to be hated for some reason. But a lot of people tell me how much, you know, good feedback they've had. And actually, quite often they get new jobs out of it by going back to projects. There have been several people who said just going back opens up new conversations and new things. So yeah, yeah, quite a few practices have used the pandemic as an opportunity to do a bit of post-occupancy, especially on projects with shared facilities like co-housing, things like that.
Great. Stephanie, I don't know if you've got any sort of anecdotes about going back to communities once you've worked with them, or any observations that you've made during the sort of the lockdown phase. Any of those that are feeding into how you work as an architect?
I think to touch on that, I guess during lockdown, it's just been a very intense phase, hasn't it? We're all locked in our homes and really understanding what works, what doesn't work. There's like, I mean, yesterday I was surrounded by drilling, so clearly all of my neighbours have decided that, you know, changes need to happen. But I think it's just a really interesting time because we have to focus on what we have. You know, as residents, but also, you know, especially a few months ago when we could only go on one walk, it was very clear about where we could walk to. And we really started to see our environment with a different lens. Like my high street on the weekend was completely buzzing. The car parks were pretty empty. So it's quite weird. It'd be interesting to see how the high street starts to, whether it will flourish or continue. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is probably a great time to look at post-occupancy evaluation because our eyes are a lot more open to what we actually have available and whether the design is efficient, sufficient, and whether we can work, whether we can, you know, people can homeschool in the same place that they work and live. And then just essentially we're just confronted with the design decisions that us as architects are making. But residents, I feel, are more empowered to understand what works for them in terms of their environment and their places, as opposed to other times. I feel like it's allowed us to slow down and really focus on what's important, so that we can design better, but also we will only accept better too.
Okay, I think I just want to maybe bring the conversation round to architects as a profession using social value as a way to, I suppose, win work, but promote themselves as a profession within the project team. Do you feel, I don't know, Riet or Flora, that there's an opportunity for architects to really own this space and to say we are experts in social value, and why not come and talk to an architecture practice about it if you are a client that is interested in working in this area, as all clients should be. But Do you see a particular opportunity for architects as a profession?
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, architects are the most highly trained members of the project team, and are often very marginal to the activities of the project. And somehow the downgrading of social value over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years has happened in a way in tandem with the downgrading of architects within the project team, I think. And this is absolutely isn't an opportunity for architects, because I don't know what other members of the project team can deliver on social value. I mean, the project manager and construction team can deliver on the jobs and apprentice side of things of the actual construction phase, but the thinking long-term about the long-term social value has to be in the terrain of architects. But I think there's also other new kinds of roles that are going to develop around long-term post-occupancy evaluation, stewardship of places, helping people to use their places in the best way possible. So I have mixed feelings about the word architect. You know, I wonder if we're going to see a whole bunch of different kinds of exciting new roles actually coming out of all of this. Which are about the analog user experience of space and also the digital user experience of it too.
Yes, I think you've got a slightly nuanced view on it, that with that opportunity comes quite a bit of responsibility.
Yes, well, and I also think architects can play a key role, but I think as the glue, I don't think we should see, because I think a lot of the siloized thinking that we've had in the past is exactly that. It's been siloized, and it's because of expert opinion on issues such as what is good quality and what delivers good place. So I think as the glue, architects there's a great opportunity in bringing the variety of voices together that should be around this table. And certainly if we look at the changes that's lying ahead of us, it looks like people, residents, need to be around that table. And it's how we do it and how that gets built into the planning process, and then the construction process and the long-term maturation of some of these places. So, and I think we should be open, and we should talk to one another, and we should liaise across the professional bodies as well, so that everyone starts talking about the same thing and look at it from the same framework. Because the problem currently is that there's a lot of people with slightly different perspectives talking about sort of the same thing, but not exactly the same thing. And I believe that is where we need to get to.
And Stephanie, do you feel for your work that it's definitely something that you, when you're pitching for work, you really big up the social value side?
Yes, yeah, definitely. But I think that's just what we're all about, to be honest. So we're very much about putting, you know, the end users first in a project, and that's where we start, that's where we end, and that's how we just continue the process. So initially people were saying, come on, that's not how it works, but I feel like it's definitely becoming something that people are focusing on more and seeing the value of.
Okay, so I might just do a sort of final whiz round the panel, just with kind of hopes for social value over the next few years, and, you know, as against fears that you might have of pressures that might be a challenge to progress. So maybe Stephanie, if you start off.
Oh, so much pressure. The hopes that we don't actually have to talk about, are you including social value, but about how are you including social value, so that we can just be talking about, so that it's just a normal conversation. It's just as important as the design. I really hope that the social value toolkit will just evolve into a platform that we all tap into to share, to really learn from, and yeah, just really heighten the conversation. Actually, I also feel like it's a good point for legacy. So I hope for social value that the way that if we're able to embed the approach well in communities when we design as architects, that the legacy will be there way after we leave, and that it's very clear what we're trying to achieve and more, so the community can really take it on for themselves in a way that's suited to them and is bespoke to them, for a community that will change, but also that value will change with them.
Okay, any potential hurdles to the way on the way to that wonderful vision?
Loads of hurdles. Lots of hurdles. It can be very it can take a lot of time. So I guess it's just about, I guess we were speaking about it earlier, about communicating that value, knowing that you need to put the time in early in order to reap the rewards, but the rewards will be there. And I think it's about that cross-disciplinary conversations and combined approach that I think could be that barrier of, you take it to a certain point, but if as an architect or designer you're not there throughout the entire process, you just don't want that to be lost. And I feel like that could be quite a big barrier at the moment. It's probably something that we face now. So, but we know the barriers, so if we can just chip away, step by step.
Riette, have I got?
Yes, well, I think there's a real challenge lying ahead with deregulation of the planning system. I don't want all of this to be seen as fluffy and go by the wayside. I think we need to look at the tools that are going to be available, and we know that there's going to be greater emphasis on design codes and design guidance. So set aside from potential zoning and increases in permitted development rights. So the design guides and the design codes is our tool to ensure quality. So we need to really embed these type of conversations on social value in that, and ensure that we understand in a tangible way what delivers it from learning from people. So that is where the opportunity lies, but I don't think we should not underestimate the challenge ahead.
I guess, yeah, so with your planning hat on, you can see a great big hurdle there, which could be wholesale planning reform, which could undermine some of this, but then what you're saying is that could be counterbalanced by the growing body of guidance and the Building Beautiful Commission, that whole agenda. You've got competing forces, I suppose, and we're not quite sure where it's going to land.
Yes.
Right, great. Okay, Flora, final few words on.
I just wanted to add to that the planning review is regarding England. And actually, Wales and Scotland have some very fantastic planning law in place. And I'm not sure about the situation in Northern Ireland, but so it's quite complicated what the impact of this English planning review will have on the other places. I would like to see a world where we all cared about each other enough that we didn't need to measure social value, and we just actually knew that it was the right thing to do. That's what I would like. And so I have a sort of my obsession with metrics and measures and things is in order to get things noticed and heard about, but I hope that they can be dismantled and then we can move forward. I also think that the climate change emergency hasn't gone away, and I think that climate change and social value are partners with each other, because it's all about making the best possible use of resources, and clearly we're heading towards very bumpy times, so we've got to make the right decisions with the little that we have going forward. So I would really hope that the UK Green Building Council would make a framework of terminology that we can all get behind and get sensible, and do some proper procurement with sensible social, economic and environmental concerns, and then we could all move on in a better way. That would be my hope and fantasy.
Great. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of work going on, not least by the three of you. So thank you very much for letting us know what you've been working on, and some of the trends that are emerging through that social value agenda. I think it's something that on building design we'll want to definitely keep tabs on, because it's fast moving. But thank you very much for your time all today. I think more information is obviously available about the social value toolkit at the RIBA. It's newly launched, so quite exciting, and I'm sure lots of material for people to read up and follow up on. But for the purposes of today, thank you all very much for attending, Stephanie, Riette and Flora, and hopefully we can come back in several months' time and see where progress has been made. But for today, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.